So we're talking about respiration, and that is the exchange of gas with our environment. Why do we need to do this? You might ask yourselves. And the answer is that we need oxygen in order for cellular respiration. So you'll remember that cellular respiration is the way that we take in and burn glucose. We combine it with oxygen and we produce carbon dioxide plus water plus ATP. This takes place in the mitochondria of our cells. And this ATP is the energy that we use to maintain homeostasis, to allow us to move, to allow us to grow, to allow us to reproduce. So this is how we obtain and why we need oxygen. Not all organisms are aerobic, but all animals are. So we can talk about like anaerobic bacteria that do not use oxygen, but all animals use, and even plants actually, use aerobic respiration to produce ATP in cellular respiration. When we look at our respiratory systems, they are designed to allow for the diffusion of gases. And so diffusion, by definition, is the passive movement. And in this case, it's gases, but it could be other things, of gas molecules from a higher to a, maybe I raised my screen here, to a lower concentration. So we do not want to expend energy to pump gas, right, to get our oxygen in and our CO2 out. So our system is designed for diffusion. And passive means that it doesn't require energy. It just automatically goes. And in fact, diffusion occurs even in non-living systems. So even like in the air molecules in this room, right, things diffuse from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. In a glass of water, if you let a sugar cube sit in a glass of water, eventually the sugar will dissolve and it will diffuse until there is some sort of equilibrium established. So that is actually really a kind of a natural phenomena that we use to our advantage, right? So that we can use it and we don't have to pump gases across the membrane. So this concentration of gases is important because it relates to what is referred to as a partial pressure. So a partial pressure of a gas is its concentration. When we think about pressure, we can talk about atmospheric gases, and we can talk about atmospheric pressure, which you'll remember is measured in millimeters of mercury. And this is just like the percentage of gas that is in our atmosphere. So I don't know exactly, I could look it up, what the concentration or the partial, you could just type in partial pressure of oxygen in our atmosphere. Okay, so the partial pressure is 100 of oxygen in our atmosphere is about 160 millimeters of mercury. And that is a percentage of the overall, which is like 760. So we could actually calculate that. I think that's like, I think that's about 21%. Let's see, 760 times, this doesn't have a star, there we go, 0.21. Yes, so that means that it's about 21%. Okay. So that is pretty high, right? But we want the concentration of oxygen to be lower in our lungs so that it will go from a higher and it will diffuse across our surface. It will diffuse across the respiratory membrane and go into our bodies when we're talking about oxygen. So there is a formula, a mathematical formula with variables that we can look at to describe this rate of diffusion. So this is my rate of diffusion. And this is actually very helpful because one, we can use it to describe how respiratory systems have evolved to become more efficient, but we could also talk about respiratory disorders, specifically like in humans where we have like emphysema. What does emphysema do to our rate of diffusion of gases over our respiratory membrane? So the rate of diffusion is like R, and I put it too close to there, so I put equals, right? Equals D, and I'll define these, times your surface area times the, this is a division, partial pressure difference. That little triangle means difference, and this would be little d. So let's look at what those are. Big D is a constant. You don't need to worry about that one. That is the characteristic of a membrane. And in our case, our respiratory membrane is deep, deep, deep inside of our body, deep in our lungs, and it's called the alveoli. The SA, that is your surface area. The delta P is the difference in the partial pressures. It could be differences in the partial pressures of oxygen on one side of the membrane versus the other side of the membrane. That is really important because if that goes to zero, then diffusion doesn't happen, right? So if this went to zero, if this increases, diffusion, the rate actually increases. D, this is the only one that has an inverse relationship. D is the distance over which diffusion must take place. So this is like the thickness of the membrane. If the membrane is thicker, if that value goes up, that is going to decrease diffusion. Diffusion is going to be much slower over a thick membrane than if it is thin. So that is why our respiratory surfaces, so the respiratory surface characteristics, they are thin. They are also moist. This is really important. In order for the gases to diffuse, they first have to be dissolved in water. So if it's not moist, diffusion will not take place. They also have to have lots of surface area. And so this explains why gills are feathery, why there is so much surface area, right? It also explains why they are so thin and fragile, right? I mean, if you think about it, the gills are so important, but they're very, very thin. So it seems like they could become damaged, right? And it also explains why when we move onto land, we see organisms that have their respiratory membrane inside their body instead of exposed to the air, because that would help to prevent water loss, right? So let's look at some examples of respiratory surfaces. What is this organism? This organism is in the phylum Platyhelminthes. It is a flatworm. Does it have a respiratory system? No. It only has the surface of its body. It is dorsoventrally flattened, and it is solid tissue. There is no coelom. So what that means is that carbon dioxide can diffuse right out, and oxygen can diffuse right in, right across the surface of the organism's body. Pretty cool. If we look at some other systems, the sea stars, they have gills on the surface of their body. The polychaete worms, this is an annelid, this is like a clam worm. It has gills on these little appendages. What is this? This is a bivalve, right? This is in the phylum Mollusca. It has gills, lots of surface area, very thin, moist because they're aquatic. And then crayfish. Crayfish have gills right under this carapace that are bathed in water. Okay, so that is very thin and moist. Now, let's look at insects. Phylum Arthropoda. Remember that the insects, the arthropods, are actually the first group of organisms that colonized land. And so they don't have gills. They have a different type of respiratory system. They have designed it very different from ours. The openings are not near the mouth. They are near the abdominal cavity. And you can actually see the abdomen ventilate, right? The abdomen ventilate, right, when you watch them. These openings are called spiracles, and they carry air right in, and really weird, almost all of the cells of the body has its own little air supply, and these are called tracheoles. So trachea and tracheoles. And you can see here in skeletal muscle, there are a bunch of tracheoles that are bringing oxygen into the skeletal muscle to allow it to produce ATP so it can contract. We also see the tracheal system in, what is this? Maybe a honeybee, right? So this would be the tracheal systems, the openings to the respiratory systems are called spiracles. This is a terrestrial lifestyle. Again, that tracheal system branches and branches and branches into these tiny little air ducts that transport. It's just hard for me to believe that that actually works, but supposedly it does, right? Okay, we, on the other hand, have a very weird arrangement because of our ancestral chordate. We have a pharynx, which is a common opening to the trachea and to the digestive system. The trachea carries oxygen down. This doesn't actually function in diffusion of gases at all. It's just a transport into the bronchi, into smaller and smaller and smaller branches. And then finally, we have the alveoli. And this is my respiratory membrane. Why is it shaped like this? Because this increases the surface area. If I took the same size and made my alveoli look like this with no folding, right? So versus like this. Okay, actually it'd be more like that. Oh, there we go. More like that, like grapes, right? Then this is gonna have a greater surface area than this. And so what we see is with the amphibians, they still have thin, moist skin like frogs. They can respire through their skin, but they also have lungs. But the lungs don't have as much surface area as, say, a reptile. So in the reptiles, we see more surface area. And then finally, when we get to the mammals, we are endothermic. We need to be really efficient at metabolism, producing energy so that we can maintain our body heat. So all of this is designed to, in the case of terrestrial organisms, having your respiratory membrane on the inside is just designed to prevent dehydration and water loss across that respiratory membrane.